welcome to this FedSoc Forum webinar call. Today, July 9th, 2025, we're delighted to host a discussion on whether the federal government should rely on competitive markets to price electricity. My name is Kayla Kleist, and I'm Deputy Director of Practice Groups here at the Federalist Society. As always, please note that all expressions of opinion are those of the experts on today's program, as the Federalist Society takes no position on particular legal or public policy issues. Now, in the interest of time, we will keep our introductions of our guests today brief, certainly more brief than their careers would deserve. So I highly recommend that if you're interested, you check out their impressive full bios at fedsoc.org. I'll go ahead and introduce our moderator, and then I'll leave it to him to introduce Professor Pesco and Mr. Davis. Today, we're fortunate to have with us as our moderator, Professor Carney, who's a senior counsel at Kaplan and Drysdale in Washington, D.C., and adjunct professor of law at Georgetown Law. Before serving in those roles, he spent some time serving as a trial attorney for the Tax Division of the U.S. Department of Justice and was in a private law firm tax practice for many years, specializing in IRS administrative practice, tax controversies, and tax litigation. He's also a former counsel to the Florida Power and Light Company and Next Era Energy Incorporated. He is a member of the District of Columbia Bar, as well as the bars of the U.S. Tax Court, U.S. Court of Federal Claims, U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, and the U.S. Courts of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, D.C. Circuit, and 11th Circuit. And I will leave it there. A last note, throughout the program, if you have any questions, please do submit those via the question and answer feature, likely found at the bottom of your Zoom screen, so they'll be accessible when we get to that portion of today's webinar. I'll ask that all questions submitted there, A, pertain to this discussion, and B, end with a question mark. With that, thank you all for joining us today. Professor Carney, the floor is yours.
Thank you. We have two participants, both very well recognized and experienced in the electric utility industry. First is Ari Pesco. He's the Director of Electricity Law Initiative at the Harvard Law School Environmental and Energy Law Program. He has written extensively about electricity regulation on issues ranging from constitutional challenges to state energy laws to federal regulation of distributed energy resources. While practicing at a firm in Washington, D.C., he litigated before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. He received his JD from Harvard Law School and holds degrees from the University of Pennsylvania in electrical engineering and business. Our other participant is Ken Davis, who has over 40 years of experience in corporate management, public service, and the private practice of law, much of which has involved some aspect of the continually evolving electric power industry. He has held senior executive positions in a Fortune 500 electric and gas company, and advise utilities, competitive generation companies, and independent transmission system operators. He received his JD from Harvard Law School and holds degrees in government and economics from Cornell University and Pembroke College, Oxford. And with that, I will ask Ken to start us off.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you all for the opportunity to discuss regulation in the electric industry, a very important topic regarding a very important industry. Now, the electric power industry is in fact vast and heavily regulated. There's permitting, there's of course environmental regulation, and many other types of rules, statutes, and regulations that apply to it. But today, we're going to focus our discussion on price regulation and how that has changed over the years dramatically as the industry has developed. Let me start at the beginning. The first electric power generating station was opened by Thomas Edison in 1882 in Lower Manhattan on Pearl Street to provide electric service over a short distance to Wall Street and the New York Times. Now, by today's standards especially, it was a very small facility. It occupied a lot about 50 by 100 feet only and transmitted its electricity over a very short distance. Now, a lot has changed in the industry and regulation. Now, the legal and regulatory system for every industry providing any sort of goods or service depends on the combination of physical, technical, economic, and political factors that define the essential nature of the industry and its product and service. The factors, all these factors combined, that define the electric industry are unique, quite distinct. Unlike other forms of power, like coal and gas, electricity cannot be stored in any significant amount for any significant period of time. The supply of electricity produced and transmitted and distributed across the electric grid to customers must be kept in very close balance with the continuously changing demand for electricity that those customers have over time, from minute to minute, day to day, and season to season. Throughout, the supply must be kept in close balance. If that is not done, if the continuously changing demand is not balanced, the electric system can quickly become unstable and widespread blackouts can result. So power plants, generating plants, must be run constantly around the clock, continuously adjusting to customer demand. Now, the production of electricity, the transmission of electricity along high voltage power lines, the ones with the big steel towers, and the lower voltage distribution of electricity across our neighborhoods to shops and homes. All of this requires the construction, maintenance, and reliable operation of massive amounts of very expensive, long-lived capital assets. The fossil fuel nuclear power stations, the hydroelectric stations, the nuclear stations, high voltage transmission lines, distribution networks, and all the rest. For just one example, in Virginia and the Carolinas, Dominion Energy has about 8,600 miles of transmission lines and over 86,000 miles of distribution lines to serve its 3.5 million customers. And those transmission and distribution facilities are designed to have a useful life of 30 to 50 years. Now, given the essential nature of electric service, regulators have always been very concerned about the availability, cost, and reliability of that service. And since the electric system spans the continent, regulation has always involved some combination of state, local, and federal entities. Now, the first combination of regulatory entities, and the first regulatory model emerged over time in the first half of the 20th century. It was a state-centric model applying cost of service retail rate regulation. Now, while some electric power systems are owned and operated by government entities, public entities, and some others by customers through their cooperatives, for our discussion today, we're going to focus on the private sector companies like Edison's Pearl Street Station. Those private companies, investor-owned, were typically vertically integrated corporations that combined the functions of generation, transmission, distribution, and customer service in one corporation. Given the significant amount of money required for such a venture, the technical requirements to deliver the electricity over a network of wires to customers, and the long-lived nature of the significant capital assets involved, given all of this, a political, legal, economic consensus was soon reached in the early part of the 20th century that it would be economically inefficient, wasteful, for electric service corporations simply to compete for their customers. Significant investment lost on unsuccessful ventures, multiple sets of transmission lines crisscrossing the country, multiple distribution lines running down our streets and in alleys. No. Because of its economic and technical characteristics, electric service was quickly deemed to be what economists call a natural monopoly. And the policymakers in the early part of the century, the 20th century, attempted to capture the economic benefits of this natural monopoly while avoiding the price and performance abuses that are typically associated with monopolies. They did this by a regulatory solution that developed at the state level for a couple of reasons. At the state level, for a couple of reasons. Early transmission equipment was limited in its ability to efficiently transport power over any significant distance, and also the federal government was slow to assert regulatory authority. The Federal Power Act was passed in 1920 to regulate the construction of hydroelectric facilities on navigable waters. It wasn't until 1935 that the act was amended to give the Federal Power Commission, later the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, authority to regulate interstate transmission of electricity for wholesale power sales between electric companies. Professor Pesco will focus on that later in the talk. But first, let me briefly describe how the state regulatory model worked. State regulatory commissioners granted a single investor-owned corporation a monopoly franchise to provide electric service to all the customers residing within a designated geographic territory, a service territory. Think of it like a congressional district. The state commissions would set and periodically adjust and reset the rates or prices that the corporation could charge its franchise customers for electric service. And upon application from the corporation and after an evidentiary hearing, the commission would set rates at a level it determined to be adequate for the corporation to receive, to recover its reasonable costs and to provide a rate of return to the corporation's investors that was adequate to attract the large amounts of capital needed to fund the construction, maintenance, and operation of the system. The state commissions set levels for prices that they determined to be just and reasonable and needed to provide efficient, economic, reliable electric service, but no more, not higher, not any higher. The economic benefits to the corporation of a monopoly franchise came with a significant obligation, the obligation to serve. The legal obligation on the company to plan for and design and construct and operate the facilities needed to provide reliable service to any home or business in the territory that requested it at the rates prescribed by the state commission. The corporation could not pick or choose its customers, adjust its prices, or decide that it was uneconomic to continue service. No, if it felt it needed more money to provide the mandated universal service to meet growing demand, the corporations could and did apply for rate increases that the commission might or might not grant. And if the commission ever determined that the corporation was earning more than required for reliable service, it could and did cut rates. And ultimately, a state commission, if it determined that the electric company was materially failing to fulfill its obligation to serve, then the commission could revoke the franchise and award it to another company. Thus, under this model, the investor-owned electric company became a utility, essentially a state-regulated utility company. This was the model, the deal, the compact, to ensure that management of the vertically integrated and responsible corporation was accountable to the customers through the oversight of the state commission. Now, This model, the state-based cost of service franchise model, worked well for all the parties involved from the 30s right through the 1960s. As generator technology improved, it brought dramatic economies of scale. The next new power plant, typically coal-fired at the time, was much bigger and much more efficient than its predecessors. Electric companies could build more power plants to meet growing demand, recover their costs, earn more returns for their investors, and at the same time, because of the economies of scale, ask state commissions to reduce their rates. The lower prices, of course, encouraged more consumption and more revenue for the company's investors. So that period of time under the state-centric model was a virtuous cycle of economics and regulation. But in the 1970s, things changed. That time saw a dramatic increase in the stringency, complexity, and cost of environmental regulation. The EPA was established. Congress enacted the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and more and more. This explosion of regulation and the associated cost collided with the development of ever larger central station electric power plants. The permitting and construction costs and rose, construction time lengthened, exceeding budgets and exceeding timelines, and electric utilities began to be going to the state commissions, not for rate cuts, but for significant rate increases to cover their ballooning costs. The requested rate increases, of course, put the state commissions as bodies of state government in a serious political bind with the customers that they, under law, were pledged to protect. An increasing number of generating plant construction projects had to be terminated because they were uneconomic to complete, thus triggering losses to the investors and significant charges to the customers. Thus, these problems with the traditional model, combined with changes in technology, generating technology, particularly natural gas-fired turbine generating technology, began to raise questions about the traditional model, because the gas turbines, the next gas turbines, the more efficient gas generating unit, was smaller and smaller than its predecessors. And as the efficiency of the next plant was associated with smaller and smaller plants that were cheaper to build, perhaps the thinking emerged that generation, at least the generation function of the electric industry, was no longer a natural monopoly that had to be included in a single corporation. So, how did regulators and policymakers begin to respond to the changes in technology and these cost problems associated with the traditional model? I think Professor Pesco has some very interesting insights to provide us about what happened next.
Thank you,
Thanks, Ken. I will, yeah, I just wanted to say, Ken, Professor Pesco, if you want to comment further on what Ken said, that's fine, or just carry forward as you see.
No, I'll carry on. It was, we didn't even really practice this, and that was a perfect handoff to what I was going to talk about. So thank you, Ken, for the historical overview. I'll talk about the 1990s, two key policies that enabled the development of competitive markets. They are utility restructuring, which was a state level policy, and open access transmission, which is a federal policy. So state regulation, as Ken described, provided utilities with a monopoly service territory, and it regulates the prices they charge to consumers. This led to two problems that restructuring and open access aim to solve. The first is risk allocation, and the second is market power. So again, as Ken described, the utility business model socializes the costs of new infrastructure. The utility pays for it, goes to the state commission, and the state commission sort of spreads those costs out to all ratepayers. But what happens if the utility spends too much money? This happened for the nuclear power plant build out of the 70s and 80s. Utilities had budgeted hundreds of millions of dollars. Projects cost billions of dollars. And I'm not here to litigate whose fault that was. It often was not solely the fault of the utility. There were a lot of factors involved as to why this happened. But to give you one example, Boston Edison, up here where I am, started building a nuclear power plant. They stopped because demand wasn't there. The project was way over budget. They told regulators that the losses from this project would be larger than the profits that the company had historically accrued throughout its history. Right? This would have bankrupted the utility if they had to absorb all the losses. What often happened in these cases was that the utility shareholders paid some and ratepayers paid a lot as well. Sometimes, like for the one here in Boston, was never even finished. So they paid money for nothing. So this is a risk allocation problem. Who pays? Should the public pay when there's these massive cost overruns? The solution that state policymakers came up with, and I'll show this on a slide if I can bring it up here. All right, the solution, this is not the right slide, one second, is restructuring the utility, removing the generation function from utility rates. The top graphic here shows sort of the vertically integrated utility where it's able to recover the cost of generation, transmission, and distribution through its government set rates. The restructured utility says, no, generation is now not part of that rate setting process. The utility is only able to recover the costs of the wires from its rates, but now generation is going to be a competitive business, and that means that investors in power plants will be the ones on the hook for their mistakes or for whatever cause of massive cost overrun. And so these new power plant investors are going to earn revenue from interstate markets, not through a government sort of cost of service rate setting process. Now, there's a problem though with the development of these markets, which is that utilities controlled market access. That would give them an unfair advantage in these new markets. No one's going to invest in the market if it's controlled by the utilities, which even though they didn't directly own power plants in this restructured model, many of them had affiliate companies that invested in power plants. So that brings us to the second problem of market power. Now, transmission lines are high-capacity power lines that connect factory-sized power plants to local distribution systems that deliver energy directly to consumers. This is a screenshot of the transmission system in sort of the mid-Atlantic, northeast part of the United States. The thickness of the purple lines here denotes the sort of higher capacity to move energy of those lines. These are the channels of interstate commerce for the electric power industry, essential for delivering products to market and for allowing new entry. Here's a sort of more close-up view of a snapshot of the high voltage system around the DC area. The various pictograms are different types of power plants that connect to the system. And what you see from this image is that if you want to develop a power plant, you need to connect to this high voltage system. So from the industry's earliest days, utilities understood that connecting to each other could reduce the likelihood and scale of power outage, and transmission links could also lower system costs. It would allow for efficient trading, things like that. High voltage transmission, though, transformed utilities from mere state-sanctioned local service providers to interstate system operators and wholesalers that collectively controlled a vital industry. Now, historically, less than 20% of utility capital spending is on transmission, but transmission has a strategic influence on industry operations and planning that is disproportionate to that share of spending. Transmission is the industry's medium of coordination that enables the industry to unlock short-run and long-run efficiencies through trading, real-time operations, and joint planning. But to be more straightforward about it, if you control transmission, you can decide who generates power, where it's generated, the types of fuels used, and where it's delivered to. Now, in 1935, as Ken mentioned, Congress gives the Federal Power Commission authority to regulate interstate transmission as well as wholesale sales in interstate commerce. Congress told the Commission to prevent unduly discriminatory transmission service. This is sort of a common law word designed in part to empower regulators to prevent anti-competitive conduct. But the Congress also charged the Federal Commission with encouraging the industry to coordinate through transmission agreements that would allow for trading and planning and other things that might benefit consumers. Now, in general, in its history, the Federal Power Commission prioritized voluntary utility agreements over its duty to police undue discrimination. But with overriding control of transmission in their monopoly service territories, utilities were able to regionalize their dominance through collusive agreements with each other that obstructed competition and cartelized infrastructure development. Ken mentioned that this sort of traditional utility model worked well for all parties involved, but often not for the rural cooperative utilities and the municipal utilities that serve about 25% of the country. In the 1960s, 70s, numerous antitrust law litigation, as well as other complaints were filed by these entities against the investor-owned utilities due to their control over the transmission system. Now, these agreements that I mentioned that allowed for sort of the large utilities to basically cartelize, to have regional cartels for infrastructure development. This was all done with the Federal Power Commission's tacit approval because, again, it believed voluntary agreements among the large utilities would ultimately benefit consumers, even if they entrenched incumbent utilities. But spurred by Congress, FERC, which was the successor to the Federal Power Commission, created by Congress along with the Department of Energy in 1977, they took a different approach to transmission. It wasn't until 1996, amidst significant changes from Congress, as well as the utility restructuring that about a dozen states did in the 1990s, that FERC formally took industry-wide action against utilities. It recognized that transmission ownership facilitates market power. Utilities were able to grant themselves priority access to this interstate system, provide themselves with better terms of service in order to thwart competition. So FERC imposed what they call open access, which is a set of minimum terms and conditions that are designed to require utilities to provide fair transmission service to all market participants. Now, historically, the transmission owner was also the transmission operator. So long as the utility implemented FERC's open access rules, it would have an incentive to tilt the system in its favor. So for instance, utilities might have an incentive to slow interconnection of power plants owned by rival companies. Utilities might want to expand the transmission system for their own benefit and not to enable new competitors to access the system. They might give their own power plants priority access to limited transmission capacity when choosing how to dispatch power plants connected to their system. So even utilities that had been restructured still had some of these sort of misaligned incentives. As I said, most utility holding companies back in the 1990s owned both the state-sanctioned monopoly as well as affiliated companies that were in the business of developing power plants that would compete in these markets. So FERC's goal was to harness markets to generate power, and it had the idea that really to do that effectively, what you have to do is separate transmission ownership from its control. So initially, back again, this is going back to 1996, FERC encouraged utilities to create new entities that it called independent system operators. These would be entities that would oversee and implement FERC's open access transmission rules. These are now called regional transmission organizations, or RTOs, and they are responsible, as Ken started out very well explaining, the RTOs are responsible for balancing supply and demand, keeping the system reliable on a moment-to-moment basis. And they quickly settled on a method for doing so. They run auctions that determine who produces electricity, as well as how much they produce at each moment of the day. Auctions would optimize system operations through competition. Low-cost producers would win the auction. They'd be tasked by the RTO with producing power. High-cost producers would only be needed when demand was particularly high, such as a hot summer day. This chart illustrates the basic aspects of how this market works. What you have here stacked along the going sort of horizontally across are different power plants. The space between them is the capacity, how much energy they can produce of each plant. Going up vertically is the price that they are able to produce power at. So we have on the left side a number of very low cost producers, all the way on the right side high cost producers, and the basic function of this RTO run market is to figure out how much demand is there going to be on the system, select all the producers to the left, the low cost producers, and then order those to produce energy at that moment. And everybody that's a high cost producer is basically left out of the market, doesn't produce any power at that moment, only needed when the demand is particularly high. The auction pays generators the marginal price. That is, the RTO stacks the offers from lowest to highest price, selects the generators needed to meet demand, pays all generators the price offered by the last generator selected. Auctions generate prices at numerous locations throughout the transmission system based on the capacity of the transmission system. So that's within a single RTO, there may be significant price disparities based on where it's cheaper to generate power and how much transmission capacity there is to move that cheap power around the region. There are numerous nuances that complicate this picture, which I won't go into in my introduction. Let me quickly touch on two challenges to in practice for how these markets actually work. One is governance. Market rules are complicated and can subtly benefit various technologies, fuels, and market participants. Who gets to write the rules for these markets? Who writes the rules for how the transmission system is expanded, for how new generators are connected to the systems? These have significant effects on price and on market outcomes. FERC, of course, approves new market rules. That's FERC's role as the regulator, but it typically defers to the entities that proposes the rules. So who has that authority to propose the rule to FERC is significant in determining market outcomes. Second, jurisdictional lines. So FERC's the market regulator here, but state policies directly affect market outcomes. So for instance, this is a map of these various regional transmission organizations. You'll see in the Southeast and the West, we have regions that are more the traditional model that Ken was describing. ERCOT is an RTO in Texas, but it's not federally regulated. Just to give you an example of the sort of jurisdictional interactions here, the states in the middle of the country, in the Southwest Power Pool, as well as the Mid-Continent ISO, those are still vertically integrated utilities. They did not, those states did not restructure their utilities, but they still participate in these RTO markets. Utilities here are typically not exposed to market outcomes because if their plants are operating in the red, the utilities can go ask state regulators to make up the difference through retail rates. So these utilities, again, traditional vertically integrated utilities, they don't profit through the market, they primarily profit by deploying capital under the traditional model. In other words, they make money when they get to build a new power plant. So they have an incentive to thwart new entry through their influence over the transmission system because new entry from other companies may block their future opportunities to deploy capital. So we have markets here, but markets where the market participants, the main market participants, are not quite behaving like normal market participants would in sort of a standard market where we think people are particularly sensitive to the final price that the market generates. Overall, just to sum up here, I prefer this model of price regulation. I think RTOs promote regional coordination which has undeniable benefits. Regional operation and system expansion is generally more efficient than a siloed utility by utility approach. And I think what we really need now, markets are better at generating innovation than monopolies. Markets provide transparency about system operations and planning that is essential for new technologies and business models. These RTOs are imperfect, but I think they are superior to the 19th century vertically integrated utility model. So I will stop sharing this nice map and look forward to questions and conversation.
Before we turn to that, Professor, we might want to just ask Ken if he has any further thoughts or comments on that great presentation you just made, and also how the just views of both of you on how the market seems to be working, or suggestions for improvement.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thank you, Professor Pesco, for really a clear and comprehensive description of the development, the emergence of, I'll say, the market model, and the reasons for that, and the case for it, and some of the challenges that it faces. Now, on the challenges, or I'll say, put a few cautionary words in favor of the traditional model that did develop in the early part of the 20th century. But I think the issue today is whether there are elements in the traditional model that are in fact superior to elements of the market model. I mean, one thing about the state-centered model was that it was a regulatory system that oversaw and held accountable a corporation, a single corporation, for the provision of cost-effective, reliable electric service in the franchise service territory. Now, the corporate form emerged a long time ago, I think sometime in the early 1600s. And it has endured over the centuries because it's a very powerful legal form, legal mechanism that combines efficiency with accountability for the success of the corporate venture and the performance of the corporate venture in compliance with the regulatory requirements of the state commissions. Accountability is a powerful concept. One of the real challenges in the market model, where transmission and planning and transmission operation and planning and other functions are overseen by the ISOs, the independent system operators, or the RTOs, is an issue of accountability. Now, just take one of the ISOs on Professor Pesco's map, New York. I think in the mid-1980s, there were 7, maybe 8 traditional vertically integrated utility companies in the state, operating in accordance generally with the model that I described earlier. Now, if you look at the New York ISO and its governance system, which Professor Pesco alluded to, there are over 400 different competing entities that participate in the governance system of the New York ISO to make rules, negotiate new rules, resolve disputes, and the rest. These 400 entities are independent power generators, they're transmission owners, they're the traditional utilities, they're consumer advocates, state representatives, power marketers, and others, and including entities that provide ancillary services, which is kind of a technical, wonky category of activities that must be performed to keep the power system up and running and balanced. Okay, so just as Professor Pesco described, all of these 400 entities meet in a so-called stakeholder governance process to try to hammer out rules for the operation of the New York power system that will result in the lowest cost and reliable service. And these entities are, as I say, competitors. And taken together because of the voting process and of the ISO governance system, no one entity, not a transmission utility, not a power generator, not an ancillary service provider, no single entity in this disaggregated model is responsible to provide electric service like the traditional integrated corporate utility was under the traditional model. And the complexity and lack of an obligation to serve, I think, pose real issues or real questions and challenges for the market model.
Thanks, Ken. We're almost ready to turn to questions. If I maybe ask each participant for one very short comment if they want to make a specific recommendation as to what steps might be taken in terms of federal regulatory policy to make the market better. Just very quickly, then we can turn to questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to very briefly to respond to the accountability point. You know, in the market model, we still do have, you know, utilities have the local service obligation still. There's still a monopoly to deliver power locally. Of course, the most severe consequence in the power system is an outage. And almost all outages are still local issues at the local level, right? It's a few thousand customers that go down at the same time. They're not things that happen at the bulk power system. So we still have the same level of accountability at the local level. And I would argue that some of the best examples of regulators actually holding utilities accountable are in the restructured states, where we've had winter storms, for example, in my part of the country here, where there have been pretty significant punishments laid down by regulators. So accountability is only as good as the regulators are willing to sort of punish the utilities for poor performance. And I think there's not a great track record around the country for a number of reasons. Regulatory capture is too simple of an explanation. I think it's often difficult politically or otherwise to actually punish utilities for poor performance, for cost overruns and things like that. So the accountability that Ken is talking about, I think, is great in theory, but often challenging to implement, and also in practice roughly the same because most of the things happen at the local level anyway. So just on sort of what should federal policy do, you know, again, I highlight governance challenges. I think that's a key issue. And the other, you know, the main role of the federal government is interstate transmission. It's something that states can't regulate in practice or under the Constitution. And so the federal government has to regulate this interstate system. Over the past couple of years, FERC has tried to put in place some reforms to improve processes for connecting generators faster. That's a critical failure right now of the market system, is that it simply takes too long to get into the market. And we can't really have a functioning market if we are not able to have efficient entry into the system. So I think there's a lot that FERC ought to be able to do it better. I think there's a process right now happening where FERC's trying to improve that. Certainly Congress could take action there as well. So I would just highlight governance and interconnection as two key issues for the markets.
One of the big drivers and issues of interconnection of generators, getting generator applications processed and analyzed for the technical reliability, electrical impact on the existing system, and all the rest. Interconnection issues. Professor Pesco is absolutely correct to refer to that as one of the current issues in the industry. But I will submit that the length of time that it has taken to only partially resolve generator interconnection backlogs and complexity and delays arises, in fact, from interconnection rules that are developed under the ISO governance process by competing entities, some of which have a real interest in having additional generation interconnected at this location and that location, and others who don't. So complexity, my general point I would say is complexity is an issue. Now, I'll also say, or raise or go back and focus on the chart, call it the bid chart, the bid stack chart that Professor Pesco put on the screen. It's a great depiction of the competitive market generation bidding process, low cost to high cost, and the system operator cuts off the bids and rewards the generators that have together provided the power needed at the cumulatively the least cost. That's terrific. That's fine. That was a compelling theoretical component in the advancement of the market model. But in operation, or I should say it this way, when that model was implemented, it was implemented over an then existing generator mix of technologies: coal, oil, gas, nuclear, hydro, and some renewable resources. A mix that had been developed by the traditional utility companies through their planning process and with approval of regulators over a long period of time to minimize cost and maximize reliability. So in that sense, the competitive market had a level playing field for all the participants at day one. But the problem for that bidding process and the problem for the market, the competitive market model, I think generally, is the fact that over time, environmental policy has subsidized and sometimes mandated the deployment of wind and solar resources, which, because of their subsidies and because of their zero fuel cost, can bid at prices that the more traditional generating technologies, natural gas, coal, oil, nuclear, can't meet. And so you have, in effect, if in a given ISO area, if the subsidies reach a certain point and the mandated retirements of fossil fueled units reach a certain point, you've got a system of power that is based on power supply technologies that are overly dependent on renewables, which, because of their intermittent weather-dependent nature, don't provide the kind of reliability, 24/7 reliability support that the customer really needs. The solar panels and wind farms, of course, are not controllable, not dispatchable. You can't increase their output to meet increased demand. So it's a real issue, not so much with the market model, but with the environmental policy that came after and was imposed on the market model.
I would
Thanks,
just
Ken.
real quick, just, I mean, I think new technologies, wind, solar, storage, are tremendous opportunities. They do require some changes to how we operate the market, but I think it's sort of like, it's like techno pessimism, I would say, to say that the only way we can operate a system is with gas, oil, uranium, and coal. I think that this is, you know, and again, these markets are geared more towards innovation, towards making the whole system work. We don't have to worry about individual generators. The whole point of a regional market system is to integrate all these different technologies together. We've been doing it now for a couple of decades. The technologies keep getting better, not just the generating technologies, but the back end technologies to make this all work synchronously. Companies and the system operators are doing it every day. And I would say that the far bigger subsidy, again, is vertical integration, which is a much bigger intervention in the market than any tax credit.
Well, thank you. We have about 10 minutes left. Maybe we could turn to a few questions. One question came in. Isn't it true that one of the largest contributors to the cost overruns on nuclear plants, such as you referred to earlier, Ari, was environmental regulation driven by maybe excessive fears of radiation?
Listen, again, I don't want to relitigate what happened in the 1970s. Certainly, there were a lot of factors. Environmental regulation was a factor. I don't think it was the driving factor, but there were a lot of complexities associated with these cost overruns back in the 70s.
Would you see that as still being a problem? I notice the current administration, I think, is trying to cut through that a little bit. Is that, would you view that as still somewhat of a problem?
Sorry, I didn't, I'm sorry, I missed the beginning there.
I said, I think there's been some action by the current administration to try to cut through and promote nuclear a little bit. Does that interact with or change what was previously the case with environmental?
I don't think they've done anything substantially to change the economics of nuclear. We've had major nuclear power plant developments in Georgia, which again was like went more than double over budget. It was supposed to be like a $15 billion project. It was well over 30 billion. I don't think environmental regulation played a significant role there. Again, it's a complicated story. South Carolina, they tried to develop some nuclear plants, even worse outcome there, $9 billion for a hole in the ground. People went to jail over that. So there's a lot going on in each one of these case studies. And I think we want to have like a boogeyman for the environmental movement. I don't think that's what's really going on here.
Well, if I'll seize the opportunity to make a point as a techno-optimist and say that perhaps what Bob Carney was referring to are recent stories and initiatives and policy efforts to try to move along the development of simpler, standardized, smaller nuclear units, the modular units and the rest of it. It is certainly true that the traditional nuclear power station, which before they were deployed, you may remember there was an aspirational concept that it will be too cheap to meter because the electricity produced out of a nuclear unit, because there was no traditional fuel costs, but that didn't come to fruition for, as Professor Pesco says, a variety of reasons. And I think, generally speaking, an approach by both the industry, the equipment suppliers, and regulators to each new nuclear unit as a bespoke one-off facility that, because of its uniqueness, raised site-specific problems associated with the complexity of that approach. So standardization maybe would be a tremendous help to the nuclear industry, which can produce 24/7 power with no greenhouse gas emissions. Bob, are there other questions?
I wasn't sure you were finished. Sure. Let's turn to another question. One person asked if in the ISO model, do new generators or transmission projects how do new generators or transmission projects get built and funded? That is asked, do they get done by utilities, through state commissions, or otherwise?
Yeah, so generation here is simpler. Typically, you have to get permits from the state for environmental reasons, things like that, but there's no sort of economic barrier to entry into the market if you can fund your project. And, as we said, the barrier is interconnecting to the transmission system. That is run by the RTOs and the utilities, but there's no sort of state economic permission that you need. It's just you have a business plan, you go and connect to the system. Transmission is a lot more complicated. I don't know if we want to go down that rabbit hole now because we could spend the rest of the time just talking about how that works. It's a mix of traditional utility projects, more market-driven projects, but I'd say it's a mix. It's mostly traditional utility projects. Some of them are planned centrally by the RTO, many of them still planned individually by each utility, and it's the traditional cost of service model. There's a merchant transmission projects sort of exist outside this whole regulatory system that's more driven by the business model that the developer has, but there's still a lot of permitting issues associated with any type of project. But we could do a whole nother hour on transmission.
Do you have thoughts on that, Ken?
Yeah, well, generation is different from transmission. I mean, in the I'll say the early days of the development of the market model, and the deaggregation, disaggregation, the separation of generation from transmission, there was a lot of talk about you've got competitive generation and you have a regulated, stable network. I think the network model concept was also important in the telecommunications area, but a highway. And it was important for the government to guarantee competitive, open access to the highway, as Professor Pesco has described. The emergence later of competitive private sector non-utility transmission projects and the fight between non-utility and utility companies over the deployment of the next piece of the transmission system is, I think, a step back from the, I'll say, simpler network model, and not an advance for the efficiency and reliability of the thing as a whole. Complexity is not, or should not be, the goal here in all the policy making going forward.
Another question that I think is interesting, because some of my background, I think I have the answer, but I'd like to hear your answers. How France has managed to have so many nuclear power plants. I understand it's like 80%, I think, of France is powered by nuclear for such a large percentage of their power. In fact, how can France do it if and we haven't? I think I know the answer, but I'd like to hear what you have to say.
My sense was that, a number of countries had a more government-owned system than we do. So I think that, I don't know the whole history of France, but most countries in Europe, at least back in the sort of middle of the 20th century, it was a single company that covered the whole country, and it was owned or significantly funded by the government. That's not the model that the United States adopted. There's a lot of interesting history there as to why, but I won't go into it.
Well, and
one thought I had heard. Go ahead, Ken.
I'll say the single government nuclear authority, like in France, was beneficial to reduce the one-off site-by-site complexity that we've talked about just a few minutes ago. Also, if you look at France, what they did in dramatic contrast to the United States is they provided a robust and still have and operate a robust nuclear fuel recycling process. In this country, what to do with the nuclear fuel that's been used for a period of time in a nuclear unit, but because of its decay, is no longer suitable for continued use to create the heat, to make the steam, to drive the turbine. And so the fuel in rods, long metal encased rods, the uranium has to be removed from the plant and replaced by a new fuel rod. And so the enormous question and a tremendous albatross over the nuclear industry in this country is what to do with the used but still radioactive nuclear fuel rods? And the answer is they're just stored. They're stored in deep pools of water. On some plant sites, they're stored in metal casks on the plant. But that's been a big hindrance to the efficient further development of nuclear power in this country.
I think looks like we've come pretty close to the end of our time. Kayla, do you have a closing for us?
I do, and I'm so sorry to interrupt because I know we could probably talk for another hour on this subject, but want to extend thanks to our panel. I really appreciate you taking this section of your days and sharing your expertise and insight and having this fabulous discussion. Thanks also to our audience for joining and participating. Welcome listener feedback by email at vidsoc@vidsoc.org. And as always, keep an eye on our website and your emails for announcements about other upcoming virtual events. With that, thank you all for joining us today. We are adjourned.